Vladimir Putin, of course, has won a fifth term as Russian president by a landslide, won 88% of the vote in what I think we can all agree wasn't a free and fair election. The opposition leaders that he had all polled on about 2.5%. None of them questioned his behaviour in regards to Ukraine, or indeed earlier than that, Crimea. He did address the death of Alexei Navalny, but basically said it was one of those things that happens to people in prison. Let's bring Michael Bociurkiw now into the conversation. He's a global affairs analyst. Michael, if I may call you that, we heard from Grant Shapps in the Telegraph today describing Putin as a modern-day Stalin, making the point that he, I think, next year will be in office for a quarter of a century, so almost as long as Stalin already. Do you agree with that analysis?
Sure, absolutely. And he will be in power longer than even Catherine the Great. What an achievement. But of course, these, I call them voter exercises, you can't even call them elections, are ones that don't even meet the low barrier of the Russian constitution itself. The failure to allow opposition candidates to run, the suppression of media, that sort of thing. Even in occupied areas of Ukraine, armed thugs went around, escorted people either to the ballot box or visited them at their home, and watched as they were voting. This was an election in many areas of the country by the barrel of the gun. And also it needs to be said that in wartime conditions or an occupied area, it is against international law to force people to vote or encourage them to vote. So it's something Mr. Putin is very proud of course. And by the way, you mentioned, Camila, Mr. Navalny, and I noted in that press conference, it was the first time any of us can recall that he actually said his name out loud. So that was interesting, too.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting. I mean, I looked at him in that press conference and the arrogance with which he kind of casually answered that question, I thought spoke to a Russian president that now seems emboldened by this fifth term in office. I mean, obviously, the death of Navalny was very timely, coming ahead of these elections. What does the picture look like for Russia? Because I suppose we can both agree that while Navalny was alive, there was a degree of hope that there could be some regime change. And now that hope has been lost.
Sure, and let's not forget the public execution of Mr. Prigozhin as well, the head of the Wagner Group. So I think for the average Russian, it's the period after a voting exercise like this that most people are concerned about, because that's usually when harsher policies are announced. For example, harsher economic policies. You'll recall a few years ago, they lowered the age for retirement. In addition, I think what we may see now that Putin feels emboldened, that he feels he has the support of the Russian public, probably another wave of mass mobilization. And that's something a lot of Russians are not looking forward to, especially folks who live in St. Petersburg and Moscow, because they've been mostly exempt from that. I'm usually based in Ukraine, and I am a little bit more anxious because I think this will also be a pivot point for Mr. Putin to, believe it or not, take even harsher actions against Ukraine. They've already been doing so with more high-tech missiles, more destructive means on civilian areas, also jamming of GPS signals, you name it. The whole range of hybrid warfare has been employed by them.
Yet at the same time, it has been encouraging to see some of these sort of silent protests on the streets of Russia. We've had ballot boxes and ballot papers ruined. We've had these sort of silent flash mobs. Obviously, people have to be very careful there that they're not protesting too overtly. Do we take some comfort from the fact that there is this very quiet, very subtle, and by the way, very brave uprising in Russia against Putin?
Oh, absolutely, because it's very dangerous to do so. In fact, a young chap was arrested the other day for having as his Wi-Fi name, Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine. I mean, that's how intense things are there right now. But if you look at the polling in the run-up to this election, you will find that there's quite a big gap between what people actually want and what they expect Mr. Putin to deliver. So, for example, a lot of polling says that Russians would like to have warmer relations with the West, but there's no way that will come from Mr. Putin. I have to say that Mr. Putin, I mean, you have to give him credit for one thing, is he has convinced a lot of people, he has driven fear into the average Russian that it's the West or the rest of the world against Russia. and that we have to stand up to them. So in this very, very controlled media environment, he's able to get away with statements like that. So that gives him a lot of room to string the Russian people along.
Final question, Michael. I mean, obviously his term in office could end if he passes away, and there have been questions in the past about his health. But the other option, of course, is he is deposed somehow. Can you see that happening? Is that likely to happen?
Well, he's gotten rid of a lot of enemies, you have to admit, including, Mr. Prigozhin, as I mentioned, of the Wagner Group. And, there's still a lot of men out there with very sophisticated weaponry that are loyal to the Wagner Group. So he has to be careful about that. The other thing is, typically in the Kremlin, Mr. Putin has been very good at playing people against each other. But I think you can reach a point where people are fed up, or perhaps because of something like the Ukraine war, some of the oligarchs who have been promised protection, who have been promised very, very fat bank accounts, are no longer getting those uninterrupted chains of revenue. So that could prompt some action against Mr. Putin. Let's see. I think it would make a very, very big difference, at least in terms of the war in Ukraine. Probably someone more sensible coming in and saying, enough is enough, too many deaths, too much damage to the Russian economy.
Yes.
Let's end this thing once and for all.
OK. Michael Bociurkiw, thank you very much indeed for joining me this evening.